Dysregulated behaviour is probably something that's been on the tip of the tongue of many parents and certainly lots of people associated with education. But in reality, dysregulated behaviour isn't really behaviour that's dysregulated. It's behaviour that's displaying a reaction or a response to a particular situation, an environment, activity, what's going on in our life, or also perhaps some internalized processing or understanding. And I always have a big thing about behavior not being used in that sense of it's a behavior, so let's just forget about it. It's actually a clue for us to really start investigating where that reaction and where that response is rooted and where that's coming from. And once we do that, then the likelihood is we can identify what that label of dysregulation actually got stuck with and why that label ended up there. And of course, when we think of behaviour in those terms, then we immediately come to mind perhaps someone who's causing a lot of disruption or causing a lot of disturbance by the way in that they are reacting and responding to their environment. And traditionally, way back in the 1920s, all of our systems are inherent to a kind of behaviourist approach. So we tend to see the behaviour and either deal with it with either rewards or sanctions or consequences. And that's become a very kind of commonly used approach where we're in school and at home, we're all about rewards and consequences. But actually, for many children, that can trigger those behaviours in itself because it's too intense. And I know a little boy who's only 4, and he recently said to me when I picked him up from school, "Oh, have I got my sticker today?" And so all day he'd been anxious about whether he was going to get a sticker for being a good boy, whatever that might mean. So thinking in terms of how can we ring those changes? And I think there's a lot of conversation now around changing the way in which we are managing those sorts of behaviours. And Dr. Naomi Fisher has wrote a fabulous book called When the Naughty Step Makes Things Worse. And whilst the title suggests it's just appropriate for very young children, it actually has got some really super thought-provoking points in it around how can we parent and how can we support in school in a more connected and collaborative way rather than using just rewards and consequences. Now, I'm not saying we need to get rid of all of those things, but we need to think about the connection and the collaboration and the understanding around those behaviours, because it's only then that we can start to change those behaviours. And I know that many people will be thinking, well, that's easier said than done. And of course it is, because actually it's the change in the way that we work inherently. It's changing our reactions and our responses so that we're reacting and responding to what's the root issue for that child. Are they fearful of something? Is there a sensory situation going on? Are they overwhelmed? And so if we start to think in those terms, then we can start to manage those situations and therefore have a more appropriate and long-term response. Because often reward and consequences styles of managing children are actually based on evoking fear in that child. So fearful they might not get that reward, fearful they might not achieve what it is that they've got to achieve. And of course, inherently then, there's a lot of intensity and intense emotion that's bubbling away and going on for our children. So not surprising that we see some of those flight, fight and fawn reaction and responses and behaviours coming out because they're carrying those expectations around with them. So working more collaboratively and in a more connected way means we're not laying on even more worrying moments that perhaps are adding to these dysregulated behaviours that we do witness. So I'm really encouraging everybody to think about things differently, to think about Naomi Fisher's approach of that more collaborative, connected way of working with our children, and to just set aside, especially if we are in a period of dysregulation, set aside expectations, see where we can really pull back on those expectations. And ironically, reward systems are expectations. So pulling back on some of the strategies that we've perhaps just used all the time, and maybe even with siblings and other people. And of course, classrooms are often set up in these formats. And the way in which we work is very much set up in that kind of whole class rewards, or, moving your peg from the sunshine to the rain or whatever. And of course, there's a lot of internalized pressure there. So thinking in terms of how we can change those systems and how we can just work in a more collaborative way so that we're working together. And we might be thinking, well, how are we going to control behaviour then? And it's not about controlling behaviour, it's about understanding the root of that behaviour. So we don't need to control it because our children aren't living in fear. They're not functioning on anxiety. They're actually working with us and walking that journey with us. And if they understand what the end goal is and why we need to get there, then actually that collaboration can ease a lot of the anxiety and the frustration that is building up, which contributes to dysregulated behaviour. So I hope that challenge to change our thinking is something that you will consider, and thinking about how we can ease on the intensity of our approaches and expectations. And have a look at Dr. Naomi's book. It's definitely worth a listen or a read.